Major Neill is executive director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, a nonprofit organization formed by police, judges, and others in the criminal justice system who believe the war on drugs has been an expensive failure that has only made our country's tragic drug problem worse. Neill first served as a narcotics agent and then oversaw 17 drug task forces during his 33 years with both the Maryland State Police and Baltimore Police forces. Neill now believes that the institutionalized racism and cost of life to both civilians and police officers are just two of the many unintended consequences of official drug policy, and that they represent too high a price. Neill is married to Denise, his wife of 26 years, and has one son, Brandon. Major Neill Franklin, welcome to the Global Freedom Report.
Grant, thanks for having me on today. I really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate your joining us. How old is your son?
My son is, wow, that's a good question, 28 now.
28. What does he think about what you used to do and the work you're now doing concerning drug policy? What are his thoughts?
He actually, the work that I used to do as far as being a police officer, commander, and what have you, basically he thought that that was great. He at one time considered following in those footsteps until I started doing the work that I'm doing now. He really appreciates the work that I'm doing now. He sees the challenges that we have within our country regarding drug prohibition. He fortunately has not been on the bad end of that, even though he has at one time experienced having his car searched inappropriately. And but he sees a lot of the harms through the interaction with his friends. So he really thinks it's a good thing. He's in my corner with that, and but he no longer wants to enter into the world of law enforcement, at least until we get some things straightened out.
And that sounds very, very sensible and sane. Before I forget, Sheriff Richard Mack wanted me to send his best wishes to you and his regards to you.
Yes.
He made some comments. He said that the only thing is, I wish that LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, I wish that LEAP would expand what they're doing and tackle some of these other extra-constitutional issues, shall we call them.
Oh, other constitutional issues. You know, that is very important to many of us here at LEAP. Quite a few of us. But at the moment, we have to remain acutely focused on ending prohibition. And we do deal directly with those constitutional issues directly affected by drug prohibition, such as the Fourth and Fifth Amendment. So, yes, extremely important. And maybe there will come a time, but right now, we really have to be like an arrow regarding these drug policies worldwide.
Now, I'm curious. I don't think I've heard anybody answer this next question. Prohibition originated with the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, the Volstead Act, which prohibited the sale of alcohol. And, of course, we know what happened. Right. We had all the gangsters who created their criminal businesses and Al Capone and all of this stuff. And then the 22nd Amendment repealed prohibition, and that was the end of it. I don't remember any constitutional amendment authorizing the prohibition of drug use. How did it ever get started? Since we have a precedent on this, how did this become what it is, this whole thing on the so-called war on drugs without any constitutional amendment? How did that happen?
That's a good point, Brent, because that's one of the reasons why I personally believe that the government's position on drug prohibition right now, I think it goes completely against our Constitution. I think it's up to the states to determine how drugs should be managed within their borders. You know, now when it comes to those drugs being transported outside of the borders, different story. But every state, in my opinion, should have that right, according to our Constitution, to manage drugs within their borders. So I think that the federal government has greatly overstepped their bounds as relates to prohibiting drugs without a constitutional amendment. I mean, the precedent has been set, as you mentioned, with the 18th Amendment, and of course then they repealed it in, I think it was 1933. So, how do they do that? I don't know. But the people have allowed them to.
That's actually the answer. Is that the people have allowed them to overstep their boundaries, and that's always the unfortunate but true answer. You spent 33 years, 33 years with police forces. You've worked the street, you've investigated, you've focused on everything from high-level drug dealers to the guy growing a single pot plant on his home balcony. How would you characterize the changes in approach to the so-called war on drugs over the past 4 or even 5 decades?
Well, it's gone through many different changes. At the beginning, which was just a few years before I came on the scene, at the beginning with Richard Nixon, he actually had more weight on the side of treatment. He had more dollars going into treatment and less into law enforcement. However, it didn't take long before the shift occurred, and federal grants became available for local law enforcement, literally bribing local law enforcement into the federal battle of drug enforcement at that level. So as you got further into the late 70s, when I came on the scene working undercover, then we were still primarily focused on arresting the dealers. We actually did try to work our way up the chain, arrest a couple kingpins, find out who's bringing the weight into the country, that sort of thing. One shift is that we have gone from that to arresting users. We figured somewhere along the line that, if we're having so much difficulty identifying and arresting the sellers and it's not making that much of a difference, let's go after the demand side. And that's when our prison population just went through the roof and now it's quadrupled. The crack era in the 1980s was another big shift. A lot of dollars became available. Our asset forfeiture laws went through some changes. The erosion of our rights started to pick up. We became more of a militarized police force here in this country. It wasn't that way in the 70s, but I mean, when you look at our police officers today, except for the colors, they dress exactly like our military. They use the same type vehicles, same type weapons, and even the similar tactics in many of our neighborhoods.
And the same language also.
The dynamic.
Same language also.
Oh, absolutely.
Deploy.
Absolutely. Deploy, yes. Even the big 3-letter word, war. I mean, everything's a war nowadays. The dynamic entries when I was working undercover back in the 70s, very seldom did we use a dynamic entry with a SWAT team, flashbang grenades and that sort of thing. But of course, we do that now for every single search warrant that we serve. There's been a lot of changes. Very few have been for the better. Now we're starting to see a shift in thinking because of the prison population, and it can no longer be afforded, not just nationally, but states can no longer afford it. Local jurisdictions can no longer afford the cost of incarcerating so many people. And it's unfortunately that's the reason that they're looking for alternatives, such as decriminalizing marijuana and other steps to keep people out of prison for nonviolent drug offenses. It's a shame it takes money to get to that point.
Well, and that's it. That money seems to be the driving feature in all of these things. And that raises another question, because I wanted to ask, how much do you think the privatization of prisons, how much influence do you think that has had on drug policy? it's my understanding that the privatization of the prison industry, the private prison industry is one of the fastest growing in the United States today, one of the fastest growing industries. And these prisons are paid money for each day they have a prisoner incarcerated, giving a financial incentive to loading them up. Has this had some kind of an influence on going after all the users? Let's load up the private prisons. And is there any connection?
Yeah. Well, obviously there is, and you really don't even need the facts to determine this. Companies like CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, I believe it's formerly Wackenhut, they're now on the circuit going around state to state asking for their business. One requirement of that business is for the state to keep their jails 90% full. Okay? That's a problem in a democratic society. It's also a problem in a democratic society when companies like this are on the New York Stock Exchange. They have lobbying in Washington, D.C. and Capitol Hill, get support for their business. This is wrong. It is so wrong. So it's become big business. You have local jails housing federal prisoners for money. It's just become this huge business. Here in the state of Maryland, prisoners in the Division of Corrections actually make furniture. They get paid pennies, a day for their work. Don't get me wrong. If they're in prison, then they have to pay their debt. But they get pennies, a day for their work, but yet the Division of Corrections is selling furniture throughout the state that they make. So they don't just make license plates in prison. So it's become big business for government, big business for private jails, and that's why it's going to be so difficult to end. One of the many reasons.
And like you said, that's the equivalent slave labor. If somebody's committed a crime, they're put in prison, they're deprived of their liberty. That's the punishment, that you're deprived of your liberty. To then force those people to exert their labor under threat of whatever, solitary or a lack of we'll take away your privileges or whatever else if you don't comply, is essentially turning them into slave laborers. And
absolutely.
Yeah, and absolutely. That's absolutely horrible. My guest is Major Neill Franklin, Executive Director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. If you have a question or comment from him, now's the time to get on board. 888-747-1968. That's the toll-free number, 888-747-1968. Or you can join us in our live chat room at www.globalfreedomreport.com. And by the way, if you are online, please don't forget to vote for the show. Real simple. Go to TalkStreamLive.com. Click on the name of the show, the Global Freedom Report. Click on the name of the network, the Micro Effect Podcast Network, and you're done. And you can vote 2 times per hour from your IP address. So we appreciate your vote and your support and your participation. Neill, you're Executive Director of LEAP. How did you go from being a staunch narcotics agent overseeing 17 drug task forces to advocating for a diametrically opposed policy? What caused you to change your perspectives? Was it a particular incident or some series of events? What did it for you?
Brett, that's a good question. When I was a lieutenant with the Maryland State Police back in the mid-'90s, the first glimpse that I got of a new way of doing business was through the mayor of Baltimore, his Mayor Kurt Schmoke. He had just instituted a needle exchange program for Baltimore because he had high rates of AIDS and hepatitis C in the city. And he also saw the violence, but, he just wanted to take a fresh look at this. He made the suggestion of having a conversation around a new approach to drug policy. And I happened to be a uniform member sitting on his needle exchange board. So that kind of gave me a glimpse, a different view of doing business, but it wasn't enough because shortly after that I became a captain and a major in the Maryland State Police, and that's when I was managing these multi-jurisdictional task forces. But it wasn't until I retired from the Maryland State Police and I was recruited by the Baltimore Police Department to be the commander of training and education for them. Just a few months after I began my new job in 2000 with Baltimore Police Department, a very close friend of mine by the name of Ed Totley, he was corporal with the Maryland State Police working undercover, and he was assigned to the FBI working in Washington, D.C. area on a task force. And Ed Totley had been working undercover with the Maryland State Police about 13, 14 years, and he had worked undercover for me on a number of very significant cases. And we had this conversation just a few months after I retired about this case he's working, and they were going to make the final buy of cocaine from this mid-level dealer and then see if they can work their way up the chain. I get a call in the middle of the night on October 30th, 2000, and it was a mutual friend telling me that Ed had been shot. I knew immediately what the case was. I knew, we just had this conversation. So my wife and I go down to the hospital, and there's literally just a sea of police officers, a sea of cops and other people that knew Ed. He worked for just about every major police department on cases in the state of Maryland. So, his wife was there, and I didn't know what happened and the extent of what happened until I got there, but the dealer had decided to rip Ed of the money and the drugs and shot him at point-blank range in the side of the head when the transaction was supposed to take place. And, he had a wife and 3 kids, and while most of the officers there and his friends were thinking, we're going to go back out into the streets and, we're going to hit this thing harder, we're going to lock up more people, we're not going to give anybody a break. As the days and weeks went on, I'm thinking, wait a minute, I know Marcellus Ward, who was working undercover and was assassinated when I was working undercover back in the 80s. He was a Baltimore police officer. I knew of 2 other Baltimore police officers who were gunned down in the streets by drug dealers. And I started thinking, wait a minute, this is not the way to go. We got to think about this. And I started looking for other police officers who were starting to feel the same way that I did. And I stumbled across Leap's brand new website in 2000, 2 years after Ed was killed. And Jack Cole responded to an email message of mine. But we lost contact for a few years. And in 2008, somehow he found me again and asked me if I was still interested in this effort, in this movement. And I said, well, yeah. So he came to Baltimore, we met, and we talked for a while, and that very day I signed me up. And I was working for the Maryland Transit Police at that time. I was commander for them at that time. That I started speaking for Leap officially in 2008. But that's it, man. Unfortunately, it took a tragedy.
Too often that's the case. That's what it takes before people will make serious changes in the lifestyles to which they've become accustomed. Did you just basically say, hey guys, I can't do this anymore, I quit? Or, was it as fast as that? Or, did you?
No, it wasn't that quick because, you got to remember, it had been a couple of decades that I was, 3 decades that I was doing this work of prohibition. This stuff had been, I'd literally been brainwashed. This was me. This was part of me. So to make that 180-degree turn, it was just a few degrees at a time as more information started coming forth. The mass incarceration, the cost, addiction, overdose deaths, starting to learn about what other countries were doing.
Officially speaking, what are the threats represented by drug use? What are some of the justifications used to authorize a war on drugs?